Today's e-session will start at 6:15 p.m. Thanks for your patience. Today's e-session will start at 6:15 p.m. Thanks for waiting. European School of Oncology. The e-session will start soon. Thank you for your patience. Today's e-session will start at 6:15 p.m. Thanks for your patience. session will start at 6:15 p.m. Thanks for waiting.
Good morning, afternoon and evening. This is the conference operator. The European School of Oncology welcomes you to the e-session 565,002. Today's session is Literature Search, How to Do It. Please note that this activity is CME accredited. At the end of the presentation, go back to the ESO website to complete the evaluation form and the CME multiple choice test. Mastermind competitors will be prompted to start the quiz after having completed the evaluation. As a reminder, during the live session, all participants can ask questions live at any time by simply pressing on the relevant button at the bottom of the page. Questions will be received by Dr. Luca Bertolacini, of the European Institute of Oncology, Milan, Italy, who will discuss them with Professor Oriana Kshani, of the SDA Bocconi School of Management, Surgas, Milan, Italy. Here is an extract of the policy which is published on our website in full. I will now hand over to Professor Kshani. Professor, your line is now open.
Good afternoon everyone, and thanks to the organizer for inviting me to deliver this methodological session as part of the European School of Oncology activities for participants from across Europe. As noted, I'm Oriana Ciani and I work at SDA Bocconi in Milan, where I teach a module of epidemiology, which includes a session on, of course, systematic reviews and meta-analysis. I think we should start without further introduction. And the first thing I wanted to notice is that I slightly changed the title for this session, because I think what we are going to cover is a bit more than simply literature searches. We are going to cover the topic of literature reviews, and in particular systematic reviews. And we will go through the methodological steps that allow us to perform a good quality review in the field of healthcare and specifically oncology. Now, let's start with this overview of study designs, which I'm sure you are familiar with. So study designs are different approaches we can take to collect data to answer specific research question. So the study design can be categorized, broadly speaking, as observational or experimental. And the difference there is, the role played by the investigator. So did the investigator assign the exposure or the treatment? in many cases. So if the investigator is simply observing the course of history with the patients, for instance, we will call the study an observational study. If there is an active role of the investigator in assigning the exposure or treatment of interest, we will call the study experimental. Now, the most common or most famous type of experimental design is the randomized controlled trials, and that is the design that we use to establish the comparative effectiveness of treatments. But we can also have experimental design, which are not randomized. So the investigator assigns the intervention, but not relying on a randomization process. If the investigator is only following the course of events for the patients, we have an observational design, and this design can have different purposes. The basic one is a descriptive, so we want to know the who, what, and where. And the most basic observational study design is case series, for instance, or case reports. But observational design can also have an analytic purpose. So they might attempt to answer the why question, and we can distinguish different observational designs, the case control, the cohort design, and the cross-sectional design, which might have this ambition of being analytic. Now, these studies are what we call primary studies. So we can collect new data through these designs. What we're going to talk about today is reviews, that is studies on previous studies. With reviews, we aim to gather previous data collected through observational or experimental studies and reanalyze these studies, summarize them, synthesizing them. So this is a graphic representation of the way I see three different concepts here. So reviews, general reviews, systematic reviews, and meta-analysis. So reviews are qualitative summary around the specific topics of interest that are broad in scope and that are not reproducible. So the author of the review can decide which sources to use for drafting the review, and we don't have actually a control over the bias exerted from the reviewers in selecting these different sources. Systematic reviews are a specific type of reviews that follow a predefined protocol. So a bit like we do with the clinical studies, we write a protocol first. We have to follow that protocol, and we want to make that because this study has to be reproducible, and reproducibility, as we know, is a fundamental, pillar of the scientific method. And then within systematic reviews that follow a precise structure, have a protocol, we can locate meta-analyses, which are systematic reviews where the authors have provided a quantitative summary of the treatment effects collected through the studies identified in this systematic way. So the focus for today's session is on systematic reviews and meta-analysis. So needless to say that for those of you who are familiar with evidence-based medicine, systematic reviews and meta-analysis sit at the very top of what we call the hierarchy of evidence, provided, of course, that the studies at each step of the pyramid are conducted, according to the best practice and to the highest quality standards. So systematic reviews are within the bucket of filtered information, exactly because there is this role of the reviewer in collecting the data, appraising the data, and summarizing the data. But they are what we use nowadays to guide clinical practice and to inform clinical guidelines. So what are the roles for a systematic review? So as I said, we nowadays we conduct systematic reviews. Firstly, because we want to inform decision making at different level in healthcare, from the individual level to the high role decision level, for instance, for what concerns approvals of drugs or other technologies. We want to inform development of clinical guidelines. We want to combine data from different studies, of course, provided that these studies are comparable enough, because by combining data, we usually are able to produce more precise results about an effect, a treatment effect. We want to explain and investigate the reasons behind the conflicting results produced by different studies. And also another role that systematic reviews have is to actually identify gaps in the literature and therefore to provide recommendations for future research. So what we are going to do today is to go through these 6 steps that are key steps in conducting a systematic review and meta-analysis. So this is the methodology that we can follow. And actually, to illustrate each of these 6 steps, I'm going to refer to a published systematic review and meta-analysis. This is a very recent paper appeared in the European Journal of Cancer. It's sufficiently broad to be of interest, I thought, to the wide audience of this session. And this systematic review is about cardiotoxicity of immune checkpoint inhibitors, a systematic review and meta-analysis of randomized clinical trials. So we will follow this paper to illustrate each of the 6 steps in the conduct of systematic reviews and meta-analysis. And by the way, if you have questions or comments, please feel free to use the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. Okay, so let's start with the first step. As every kickoff step in clinical research, I think we need to start with a good, clear research question. And the way to formulate a clinical question is through the population intervention comparator and outcomes framework, the PICO framework, so-called. So for the paper that we are assessing today, the population of interest is actually all solid tumors. They excluded the hematologic malignancies, but they focused on solid tumors. The intervention of interest is, as the title says, immune checkpoint inhibitors, either alone or in combination with standard treatment. And the comparator of interest is any other systemic treatments, like chemotherapy, targeted therapy, or placebo. Actually, there is a secondary objective for this systematic review, whether they compare dual ICI regimen versus a single ICI regimen, but the primary objective will be our focus today, and this is a comparison between immune checkpoint inhibitors versus other systemic treatments. The outcomes of interest in this case is cardiac adverse events. And this could be either myocarditis, arrhythmias, pericarditis, myocardial infarction, heart failure, cardiac arrest, valvular diseases, or cardiac death. So it's important to notice here that this outcome is not an effectiveness outcome here, but it's a safety outcome. And we might go back to this element. And finally, there is an additional element specified, that is the study design of interest. And these authors for this paper actually wanted to restrict the searches to randomized controlled trials only. So they wanted to consider only randomized experimental evidence. The second step for a good conduct of systematic reviews is actually to develop a protocol for the review and to register this protocol. A bit like we do for clinical trials, we register trial protocols when the trial starts on public registries, for instance, clinicaltrials.gov. We have a similar platform for systematic reviews protocol. The platform is called Prospero. And as you can see, we have an ID that is associated to the protocol developed by the authors Agostinetto et al. For the paper we are analyzing. The next step is about designing the search strategies, conducting the literature search, and screening titles, abstracts, and full paper. And we can go through the paragraph that describe what the authors of our cardiotoxicity paper did. So they searched a number of databases for the biomedical literature, so PubMed, Medline, and Bayes, and also the proceedings for the ASCO annual meeting and ESMO Congress. This is a common practice, I would say, although we are seeing now more and more inclusion among the sources to be searched of registries for clinical trials in order to capture maybe trials that have been completed but have not reported yet their results. Also, it's becoming very common to include in these searches archives. So, for instance, bioarchives or medRxiv, where you could find trial manuscripts that are still, undergoing the review process and have not been peer-reviewed yet. The second section is about the search strategy that the authors developed, and this is actually a very simple search strategy. If you remember the PICO framework we have just introduced, this search strategy is only capturing the interventions of interest. So there is a list of the generic names of I assume ICI, immune checkpoint inhibitors drugs, and those were the only keywords combined with an OR logic connective to run the searches. So actually there is nothing in this search strategy about, for instance, the population of interest or the outcomes of interest or the RCT, the study design of interest. And finally, after they retrieved through these search strategies hints for publication, they applied something that is very common in systematic review of independent screening by 2 reviewers. Who applied independently, again, exclusion and inclusion criteria, and in case of disagreement, a 3rd investigator was involved. Again, this is very standard practice. What we are showing here is an important figure in every systematic review. This diagram is called the PRISMA diagram, and it's basically a summary of the various steps in the identification, screening, eligibility and inclusion of studies in a systematic review. PRISMA stands for Preferred Reporting Items for systematic reviews and meta-analysis, and is actually the reporting guidelines we want to follow when we write up about the results of a systematic review and meta-analysis. So as you can see in this flow diagram, we indicate the number of included papers, excluded papers, and excluded papers in this case, as you can see, are quite a lot. For instance, the authors had to exclude a lot of non-randomized studies because one of the inclusion criteria was exactly on the study design, only randomized studies. And this is actually a result of the way the key search strategy was designed, because as we just said, the search strategy didn't have like words or terms for randomized design. As a result, they had to exclude them after through the screening based on titles and abstracts. So after the relevant studies have been identified, the next step is about appraising the quality of this study. And study quality is actually a complex concept. We can distinguish about two forms of quality, or let's say validity. We can talk about external validity, which is an element of quality for clinical studies, and external validity is about the generalizability of study results to our context of interest, to the context where the decision informed by the systematic review will be made. For instance, in this case, we had a list of generic names for immune checkpoint inhibitors. If we want to use the results of this study in Italy, for instance, where I'm based now, I would like those like high CE drugs to be available in clinical practice in my setting in Italy. The other part of the concept of quality is internal validity, and internal validity is also called the risk of bias, and this is where we judge whether we can trust the results of the single study, whether the findings are reliable or not, whether, you know, from a methodological point of view, the trialist, the investigator, did everything possible to make sure we could reach a reliable finding. So what the authors did to assess the risk of bias of included studies, again, this was a very standard practice approach. They applied a risk of bias tool, actually the Cochrane risk of bias tool version 2. That is a tool that is specific for randomized controlled trials with parallel group design. And it's a tool that goes through 5 different dimensions of bias: the randomization, the deviations from the intended intervention, missing outcome data, measurement issues with the outcome of interest, and selective reporting or selection of reporting results. This is actually a screenshot taken from this Cochrane risk of bias tool for randomized controlled trials. As you can see, this is looking at one of the 5 domains, the risk of bias related to deviations from the intended intervention. And as you can see, there are probing questions that help the reviewer to identify potential fallacies in the study. So in this case, they ask about the blinding, for instance, of patients or carers or operators, and they ask to provide a judgment in terms of the level of bias, whether high risk of bias, low risk of bias, or unclear risk of bias, because there was not enough detail to make this judgment. And this is how we summarize the results of this quality assessment. So we have a list of all the studies included in the review and the indication of the 5 dimensions of interest for the risk of bias. Green spot is a study with a low risk of bias or judged has a low risk of bias. A red box, a red spot, sorry, is a study at a high risk of bias, although we didn't have a high risk of bias in this list. And finally, a yellow spot is for studies with an unclear risk of bias, which means there were not enough detail for the reviewers to judge about the quality. This is another key tables we find in systematic reviews. This is basically a summary of the main features of the trials included. So first author, the name of the trial, in this case, year of publication, whether it was a phase 3 or phase 2 trial, the tumor type, the setting, more details about the treatment of interest, and median follow-up reported, which is actually important in this case, because remember, we are dealing with the safety outcomes of immune checkpoint inhibitors. Again, if you have questions, feel free to type them down in the Q&A section. Okay, let's move to the next part where we try to provide a quantitative summary of the results collected across the studies identified with these systematic reviews. And remember, when we do this quantitative pooling of data, this is where we actually perform a meta-analysis. When to perform a meta-analysis, we actually need to have outcomes reported in a fairly homogeneous way. So the measurement of the outcome should be like reasonably comparable across studies. Also, we want, in general, the studies to be, let's say, homogeneous, or to keep heterogeneity between studies low. We also need to express findings, treatment effects in standardized format. So we can use crude raw data or treatment effects homogeneously across studies, odds ratio, risk ratio, hazard ratio also, or we could meta-analyze mean differences, either standardized mean differences or weighted mean differences for continuous variables across studies. Actually, the meta-analysis is a way to provide a weighted average of the effect estimates from individual studies, and we could calculate this weighted average in different ways, and we have to agree on the approach we chose to define the weights to use for the weighted average. There are two broad approaches we could follow. The first one is the fixed effect approach. We use fixed effect model when we believe there is one true effect behind all these studies, because they are very similar one to the other. So we try to estimate this single true value from across the studies we have identified. The random effects approach or random effects model actually considers there is a true distribution of treatment effects behind these studies that we have identified. And actually what we try to estimate is the average, the mean of this distribution of treatment effects. And we could follow different approaches there. The authors of the cardiotoxicity trial actually do not specify which specific approach they followed within the random effects family models, but probably they used the Darcy-Moignan and Laird method, which is the most common and the default option for the meta-analysis command in Stata, the software that they use to run the quantitative analysis. Now, if we consider like combinations of different findings from different studies, we have to consider that we will deal not only with the within study variability, so the individual study variation, but also with the variability between studies, what we call between study variance, or the tau square in the statistical jargon. So these three panels are there to show graphically what are the differences between the two concepts. So take panel B. So this is a situation where we have a high within study variance and a relatively low between study variance, whilst panel C is a situation where we have a very low within study variance and a comparatively bigger between study variance, whilst the first panel A is ideal because we have at the same time a low within study variance and low between study variance, and this is actually a better situation to deal with. When we run a systematic review and meta-analysis, actually the best way to report the results is through a graphic, and graphic representation we use for meta-analysis is the forest plot, and this is actually the output provided in the Agostinetto et al. Paper. So the forest plot indicates the list of individual studies, then a graphic representation of treatment effects from each single studies, and these are the boxes you see there. The boxes have different sizes, and the size actually depends on the weight that the single study is given in the determination of the weighted average. Remember that the summary effect, as we said, is a weighted average of results from each single study. So the bigger the size of the square, the bigger the weight, that study was assigned in pooling the summary effect. There are also diamonds in this graphic, and the diamonds are the summary effect. Actually, in this graph, we have two subgroups effect and an overall summary effect, the diamond at the very bottom of the figure. So the results here after pooling from across the different studies is a risk ratio of 1.14, that is not significant, with a 95% confidence interval that goes from 0.88 and up to 1.48. At the right part of the graph, we have raw data from each single studies. And remember, these are the cardiac adverse events observed in the immune checkpoint inhibitors arm versus the non-immune checkpoint inhibitors arms. There are other informations reported in forest plot. Usually, these information are the I-square and the p-value attached to this I-square value. So I-square is an important statistic that we use to capture or measure the heterogeneity between studies. So this value goes from 0% up to 100%, with the 0% meaning that there is no heterogeneity across these studies. In this case, we have a low level of heterogeneity measure, 16%, with a non-significant p-value attached to that. So that means that we shouldn't bother too much about variation across these studies, and actually this is also what immediately comes out by visual inspection of this forest plot. So a bit more about this concept of heterogeneity that is important in guiding also the choice for fixed effect meta-analysis or random effects meta-analysis, and more in general on how to combine results from different studies. So I-square, as we said, is one statistic that we see reported more and more often, together with the Cochrane Q statistic, which you can see at the top of this slide. So this is a way to measure heterogeneity that is in excess with respect to what would be expected by chance alone. And this is what we try to capture with these two indicators, I-square and Q statistic. Very last slide, and then we will open up for questions. So there is another graphic element we usually find in systematic reviews and meta-analysis. This is the funnel plot, and the funnel plot is what we use to again discuss heterogeneity a bit further, and also discuss bias, reporting bias or publication bias. The funnel plot is a graph where we see the effect reported on the x-axis, typically on the log scale if we work with the risk ratio or odds ratio. And on the y-axis, we have a measure of the precision from each single study. So in this case, we have the standard error reported from each single study in reverse order. So the graph is so that the very precise maybe very large studies sit at the very top of this funnel, and then the less precise, smaller trials spread at the bottom of this funnel. And if heterogeneity is not a concern and the bias is not a concern, what we will find is a very symmetric funnel plot. And actually, there are tests that measure the symmetry of the funnel plot, and the p-value attached to this test, we want them to be non-significant, of course. In the case of Agostinetto et al. Study, there is a first funnel plot that is overall symmetric, and this is the funnel plot that refers to all cardiac events in general. There is a second funnel plot that deals only with myocarditis, and in that case, there is some asymmetry coming up. So the p-test, the Egger's test, is below 5%. That means that probably the searches have missed some of the information about myocarditis reporting. Now, to conclude, I think with this like a brief session, we covered what a systematic review is in comparison with the general reviews. So systematic reviews are secondary research studies that use data produced previously through clinical studies to summarize available evidence within a specific research question of interest. Systematic reviews, we said, follow a predefined protocol, and we want them to be reproducible by others. When they are combined with meta-analysis, they provide a quantitative summary of the results collected through these different studies, and usually these results are more precise compared to what we get from single individual studies. Meta-analyses are weighted average of the effect estimates from individual studies, and there are different ways and approaches to define the weights to be assigned. When pulling data from different studies, it is very important to discuss the heterogeneity that we see across different studies, and decide whether it is appropriate to combine them or not. I think I will stop here, and then I will wait for questions from either Dr. Bertolaccini or from the attendees. Thank you.
Thank you to Professor Ciani for this huge presentation. This afternoon session was one of the most attended of the methodology track, and we have several questions from the audience, real question and not prepared question. The first is from Riccardo Caponero, and is the hierarchy of evidence is still valid in the era of precision oncology with target therapy?
Yeah, so let me say something about this hierarchy of evidence. So first of all, the hierarchy stands provided that the various levels in the pyramid are conducted in the best way possible. So, of course, we prefer randomized controlled trials over case control studies, for instance, but the RCT should be like one that is run properly. If the RCT is not run properly, whilst the case control is, robust, solid enough, of course, I would prefer the results from the case control over not well done RCTs. The second clarification there is, I think we should always be clear about what we are using the evidence for. So the question about the precision oncology is mainly referring to the setting. Okay, we know that there are a possibility nowadays to identify targets for treatment, but if in this broad scenario, broad setting, we are still tackling the question of comparative effectiveness. So probably I would say that we should still refer to good quality RCTs. Studies designed to address the question of comparative effectiveness for targeted therapies, let's say. But this is my view. I don't know whether Dr. Bertolaccini has a different opinion on that.
No, I totally agree with you. And Riccardo asked also, is a randomized study still needed when target therapy is much more efficient than conventional treatment?
Again, and I see this type of discussion a lot because for the work I do, we talk a lot about the availability now of real-world evidence. We can collect data, data that escape the framework of the randomization. But again, if the question we want to answer is about comparative effectiveness in relation to an alternative treatment, I still think that randomization is key. And then we can complement the results of a randomized study with observational evidence that provides additional information, maybe in different groups, for different types of outcomes. For instance, the example we follow today was looking at a safety outcome. We know that to assess the safety of intervention, probably randomized studies is not what we want to look at. We want long-term registry data. So in that case, we could open up to observational designs and complement the randomized design with the non-randomized studies. Yeah.
Christos Dagres asks, what is your opinion about the umbrella reviews? Do they provide an higher level of accuracy in their analysis?
Okay, so this is an interesting question because we focus today on systematic reviews and meta-analysis, but we have also, because the evidence is growing and growing, we have also nowadays umbrella reviews, which are basically overviews of different reviews conducted by different authors on like slightly different aspects around the same topics. So umbrella review might be useful again to summarizing in a narrative way the evidence that is out there for on a specific topic, but we don't have now quantitative tools to combine from across systematic reviews. So again, if we focus on the effectiveness question and summaries of treatment effects from trials, I would still prefer the meta-analysis, the simple meta-analysis approach, and I will keep umbrella reviews as like qualitative summaries from different systematic reviews. If we think that there is value in, providing a synthesis, narrative synthesis from these different studies on different aspects of the same topic.
Thank you for your clear answer. Raul Haora asks, in which scenarios would you perform a network meta-analysis?
Oh, this is a very good question because one of the limitations of meta-analysis so far is that you can combine only two alternative treatments. So in today's example, we combined, or the authors combine ICE all together with all alternative standard treatments. But we might want to make comparison on more than two available alternatives. And this is where network meta-analysis become useful and relevant. And this is actually an area that has seen a lot of development recently. So within network meta-analysis, we can distinguish between indirect treatment comparisons or mixed treatment comparisons. And the difference there is that with indirect treatment comparison, we infer the head-to-head missing treatment effect by looking at treatment effect from other trials that have run head-to-head comparison with a common comparator. With the mixed treatment comparison, we basically use all the evidence available through a network of treatments, of course, within the same indication. And the statisticians say we borrow strength from other trials in order to learn a bit more about the treatment effect among the two treatment under comparison of interest. And of course, this is done within a Bayesian evaluation framework, and we derive after this the evaluation is performed ranking of options. So we will have the best performer, the best treatment, and the worst treatment in this ideal ranking across the multiple available options.
So we have two answers from anonymous attendees and our technical question. The first is the registration of the protocol on Prospero or similar, I say, is mandatory or is simply to strengthen the methodology of the systematic review and the meta-analysis?
So I would say that, of course, it strengthens the quality of the meta-analysis and might be a requirement for publication if you want to publish the systematic review. It's not mandatory in the sense of what we see for clinical trials. You know, the FDA, for instance, mandates to register the protocol of clinical trials before launch, and that's like a more stringent requirement. Here is more, you know, methodological quality requirement, and something we want to do in order to publish the paper at the end. Any other questions? Oh, I see another.
Yes, we have a question from two anonymous attendees. One is what to do when we have more than two alternative treatments?
Oh, I think we answered this question with the previous one on network meta-analysis. So when we are in situation where more than two available options, like intervention and comparators are there, that's where a network meta-analysis becomes relevant.
And the last question from the audience is, would you recommend software like RevManager from the Cochrane to perform a systematic review and meta-analysis?
Yeah, so nowadays there are many statistical softwares available to do actually the quantitative part, the meta-analysis. For instance, R, Stata, they all have packages for meta-analysis. RevMan is actually the software endorsed by Cochrane. We know that Cochrane is the association that leads the production of good quality evidence in medicine and healthcare, and probably for that reason, RevMan is the most famous or known software for systematic reviews and meta-analysis. But as I said, there are many others that can be used for the purpose.
Thank you, Oriana. I will search your name in the reviewers panel list of the journal where I could submit meta-analysis because you are a really expert and hard reviewer. So I think that you reject my paper. Thank you for your beautiful presentation, for your clear answer, and thank you to the attendees. Have a good afternoon, evening, night, and day.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Cciani, and thank you, Dr. Bertolacini. Ladies and gentlemen, the session has now concluded. If interested in CME accreditation, participants should fill in the evaluation form and pass the CME multiple choice test. To enter the CME section of the site, please close this window and go back to the ESO website. If you are a mastermind competitor, you will enter the quiz after the evaluation. The next ESO session will take place on the 30th of March at the same time. And Dr. Etienne Brain, of the Hôpital René Hugouenin, Institut Curie, St. Cloud, France, will discuss with Dr. Laura Biganzole, of the Prato Hospital, Prato, Italy, the following topic: systemic treatment of early breast cancer, anything different in elderly women? Thank you for participating, and have a pleasant evening, day, or night. Goodbye.
Grazie a tutti. Devo dire
Grazie mille.
Gran numero di persone che si sono collegate e tutte le domande del panelist. Grazie davvero.
Grazie a voi.
Arrivederci, buona
Grazie a voi.
serata.
Buona serata.